Nigeria did not begin as a mistake, but it began as a compromise shaped not by the people who would live with its consequences, but by an empire that was already planning its exit. When Nigeria gained independence in 1960, it inherited more than flags and anthems. It inherited a political structure designed for control, not cohesion, for administration, not identity. The country that emerged was vast, diverse, ambitious, and dangerously unprepared for the pressures placed upon it. Nigeria was not one nation in spirit, it was several worlds forced to share one roof. The British colonial administration had welded together hundreds of ethnic groups, languages, religions, and political cultures into a single territorial unit. This welding was not done carefully. It was done quickly, cheaply, and with little concern for long-term stability. The goal was efficiency, not unity. By independence, Nigeria was divided into three dominant regions: the northern region, the western region, and the eastern region. Each region was politically powerful, culturally distinct, and deeply suspicious of the others. Each feared domination, each feared erasure, each believed that control of the federal center was the only guarantee of survival. Politics in the early years of independence reflected this fear. Rather than national parties built on ideology, Nigeria developed regional parties built on identity. Loyalty flowed first to region, then to ethnic group, and only lastly to the nation itself. Federal politics became a battlefield where regional interests collided, not a forum for national consensus. Yet despite these weaknesses, Nigeria's first republic still represented something rare and fragile: civilian rule. Disputes were intense, sometimes bitter, sometimes violent, but they were disputes among politicians, debated in assemblies, contested in courts, argued in newspapers. Elections, however flawed, were still the recognized path to power. Civilian institutions, though young and imperfect, were functioning. Nigeria was struggling, but it was learning. The military at this time was meant to be invisible. Its role was external defense, ceremonial presence, and obedience to civilian authority. Soldiers were not expected to rule, they were expected to obey. But beneath the surface, pressure was building. The regional elections of the early 1960s exposed deep fractures. Accusations of rigging, intimidation, and manipulation became common. Political violence increased, especially in the western region, where internal party conflict erupted into chaos known as Operation Wheatie. Homes were burned, lives were lost, law and order appeared fragile. To many Nigerians, civilian politicians began to look incapable of governing fairly. Corruption scandals dominated headlines. Patronage replaced policy. Ethnic loyalty outweighed competence. Into this atmosphere of disillusionment stepped a dangerous idea that the military could do better. This idea did not originate in Nigeria alone. Across the post-colonial world, newly independent states were struggling with similar problems, and in many of them, soldiers began to see themselves not as servants of the state, but as saviors of the nation. The belief was seductive. Soldiers were disciplined. Soldiers were national, not regional. Soldiers, it was said, were above politics. But this belief ignored one critical truth: soldiers are still human, and power still corrupts. Within Nigeria's military, grievances were forming. Young officers watched politicians enrich themselves while the nation struggled. They saw ethnic favoritism mirrored within the armed forces themselves. Promotions, postings, and influence were often perceived through regional lenses. The military was not immune to Nigeria's divisions. It was absorbing them. Yet no one truly imagined that the army would overthrow the government. Nigeria was still too new, too hopeful, too optimistic for that. The memory of colonial rule was fresh, and civilian independence felt precious. Few realized how thin that protection really was. By 1965, Nigeria stood at a crossroads. The political system was under strain, but it had not collapsed. Reforms were possible. Dialogue was still available. Elections, courts, and negotiations, however flawed, remained open paths forward. Nigeria could have stumbled, corrected itself, and matured. Instead, it took a shortcut, and that shortcut would prove fatal. When soldiers finally stepped into politics, they did not come as neutral arbiters. They came carrying the same fears, biases, and ambitions that plagued civilian leaders, now backed by guns instead of ballots. The tragedy of Nigeria's first coup is not simply that it overthrew a government. The tragedy is that it ended an experiment before it could evolve. The First Republic was not given time to fail properly, to learn from its mistakes, to reform itself through civilian means. It was interrupted violently by men who believed they could force unity where patience was required. That interruption would echo for decades, because once the military crossed the line from defender to ruler, Nigeria's political culture changed forever. The idea that power could be seized rather than earned took root. The precedent was set. And from that moment on, Nigerian politics would never be the same. The coup did not emerge from nowhere. It was born from frustration, fear, and misplaced confidence. But its consequences would extend far beyond its causes. Nigeria was still standing in 1965, but it was standing on unstable ground, and the first gunshot of 1966 would shatter whatever balance remained. The coup did not announce itself. There were no broadcasts, no warning, no declaration of intent. Nigeria went to sleep on January 14, 1966, believing it would wake up to another troubled but familiar day of civilian rule. By dawn, that illusion was dead. In the quiet hours of the night, a small group of young army officers began moving into position. They were not acting under orders from the top of the military hierarchy. This was not a coordinated institutional takeover. It was a rebellion driven by conviction, frustration, and a belief that history was on their side. These officers believed Nigeria was drifting toward collapse. They believed corruption had become entrenched. They believed civilian leaders were destroying the country faster than any foreign enemy could. And most dangerously, they believed that violence was a legitimate cure. At the center of this plot were men who saw themselves not as traitors, but as patriots. Their plan was simple in theory and reckless in execution. Remove key political leaders, seize control of strategic locations, and hand over power to what they believed would be a corrective military authority. They expected resistance, they expected blood, but they also expected clarity. What they got instead was chaos. The first targets were Nigeria's most powerful civilian figures. Prime Minister Abubakar Tafawa Balewa was arrested in Lagos. He was not given a trial. He was not allowed to speak. He was killed quietly, his body later found by the roadside. His death symbolized the end of Nigeria's parliamentary leadership. In the northern region, Premier Ahmadu Bello, the Sardauna of Sokoto, was attacked at his residence in Kaduna. Bello was more than a politician. He was a symbol of northern authority, tradition, and influence. His killing sent shockwaves through the region, shattering any illusion that the coup was merely administrative. In the western region, Premier Samuel Akintola was also killed. Akintola had been embroiled in fierce political conflict, but his execution eliminated the possibility of civilian reconciliation in the West. These killings were not arrests gone wrong, they were deliberate eliminations. Yet while some leaders were executed, others were spared. This unevenness would become one of the coup's most destructive legacies. As news spread, Nigerians struggled to understand what was happening. There was no unified message. Radio stations went silent or broadcast confusion. Military units acted independently, unsure whether to resist or comply. Some officers supported the coup, others opposed it. Many simply waited. The coup was failing in real time. Key military installations were not secured. Several senior officers remained free. In Lagos, the plotters failed to capture or neutralize the entire command structure of the army. The country was in limbo, caught between a government that had been killed and a coup that could not fully take control. This failure created a vacuum, and in Nigeria, vacuums are dangerous. By morning, Major General Johnson Agui Ironsi, the most senior officer in the Nigerian army, emerged as the central figure capable of restoring order. He was not part of the coup. In fact, he had narrowly escaped assassination himself. Ironsi moved quickly. Loyal troops were deployed. The coup plotters were arrested or neutralized. By the end of the day, the coup had officially failed. But Nigeria had not been saved. Because although the coup collapsed militarily, it succeeded psychologically. For the first time in Nigeria's history, politicians had been removed not by elections, impeachment, or courts, but by bullets. The line between civilian authority and military power had been crossed, and it could not be uncrossed. Even more damaging was the perception that followed. In the days after the coup, Nigerians began asking dangerous questions. Why were most of the victims from particular regions? Why were some political leaders untouched? Why did the pattern of violence appear selective? Whether intentional or coincidental, the narrative took hold quickly that the coup was not just political, but ethnic. This perception hardened into resentment. In the north, the killings were interpreted as an attack on regional leadership. Grief turned into anger, anger turned into suspicion, suspicion turned into preparation for retaliation. Trust between regions, already fragile, collapsed entirely. The coup plotters may have believed they were correcting injustice. Instead, they had deepened it. The failure of the coup also produced an unexpected outcome. The military now had no choice but to rule. With the civilian leadership decapitated and the political system in ruins, power could not simply be handed back. There was no functioning authority to receive it. The army stepped in, not as a temporary caretaker, but as the only remaining structure capable of governing. Ironsi suspended the constitution. Civilian politics was effectively frozen. Nigeria entered military rule not through careful planning, but through necessity born of violence. This moment marked the true death of the First Republic. The coup did more than kill leaders. It destroyed the principle that political problems must have political solutions. From that night onward, force became a legitimate option in the national imagination. Young officers had demonstrated that the state could be seized. That precedent was now embedded in Nigeria's political DNA. What made January 15, 1966 so catastrophic was not just what happened, but what it taught. It taught that impatience could justify violence, that frustration could excuse murder, that ambition could hide behind the language of reform. The coup did not solve corruption. It did not end ethnic tension. It did not unify the nation. It only changed the method of struggle. By the end of that day, Nigeria was no longer a fragile democracy trying to mature. It was a wounded nation under military control, unsure whether it had been rescued or hijacked.
The answer would come soon enough.
Because the forces unleashed that night were not finished. They were only beginning.
Power did not arrive in Nigeria calmly after the coup.
It arrived reluctantly, nervously, and under pressure. Major General Johnson Aguiyi Ironsi did not seize control out of ambition. He inherited it from chaos. The civilian government was gone. The constitution was suspended. The country was tense, grieving, and dangerously divided. Someone had to hold the center or watch Nigeria fall apart immediately.
Ironsi presented himself as that stabilizing force.
He was a professional soldier trained in hierarchy, order, and obedience. To him, Nigeria's problem was not diversity, history, or colonial design. The problem, as he saw it, was indiscipline. Too much regional autonomy, too many political centers pulling in different directions, too much disagreement. His solution was simple, logical, and catastrophic. Centralize power. Ironsi believed that Nigeria could be unified by removing the structures that allowed division to thrive. Federalism, in his view, encouraged ethnic competition. Regional governments, he believed, deepened loyalty to identity rather than nation. If Nigeria was to survive, he thought, it needed to become one tightly controlled system. This belief would lead to the single most consequential decision of his brief rule. But before that decision, Nigeria was already unraveling. In the months following the January coup, the atmosphere in the country was thick with fear and suspicion. Rumors traveled faster than facts. In the north especially, anger simmered just beneath the surface. The killings of January 15th were not seen as isolated crimes. They were seen as targeted humiliation. Northern officers felt betrayed. Northern civilians felt exposed. Many believed the military government was protecting the coup plotters rather than punishing them adequately. Trials were slow. Justice felt selective. Silence felt deliberate. Ironsi's government did little to ease these fears. His administration was quiet, cautious, and opaque. Decisions were made within military circles, far from public debate. Communication was limited, empathy was absent. The wounds of January were not addressed, they were ignored.
And ignored wounds fester.
When Ironsi finally moved decisively, it was not toward reconciliation, but toward restructuring the state. In May 1966, he announced Decree No. 34. The decree abolished Nigeria's federal structure and replaced it with a unitary system of government. Regions were dissolved in all but name. Power was centralized in Lagos. Authority flowed downward from the military head of state, not outward from the people. On paper, it was presented as administrative reform. In reality, it was political dynamite. To many in the north, Decree number 34 confirmed their worst fears. It looked like consolidation of power by a group they already distrusted. It felt like the erasure of regional safeguards. It sounded like domination disguised as unity. The fact that Ironsi himself came from the eastern region only intensified suspicion. Intentions no longer mattered. Perception ruled everything. Across military barracks, resentment hardened. Junior officers whispered. Senior officers watched carefully. Ethnic lines, already strained, snapped into focus. The army, once imagined as a neutral national institution, was now openly divided. And outside the military, the situation was worse. Northern civilians, still traumatized by January's killings, felt increasingly unsafe. Rumors of planned domination spread. Markets became tense. Neighborhoods grew hostile. Nigeria was no longer simply divided. It was polarized.
Ironsi misread the moment.
He believed firmness would restore confidence. He believed speed would prevent collapse. He believed unity could be engineered. But unity imposed without consent becomes oppression. By centralizing power so quickly, Ironsi did not heal Nigeria's fractures. He deepened them. He took a nation already bleeding and tightened the bandage until circulation stopped, and the reaction was inevitable. By June 1966, the atmosphere within the military was combustible. Northern officers no longer trusted the command structure. Many believed they were living under a government that neither represented them nor protected their interests. Discipline weakened. Loyalty shifted from institution to identity. The army was no longer one force.
It was multiple armed camps sharing uniforms.
Ironsi remained largely unaware of how close the country was to explosion. His administration continued to operate as though resistance could be managed through command alone. There was no national dialogue, no truth-telling, no attempt to address grievances openly. Silence became policy, but silence does not calm fear.
It amplifies it.
In this silence, plans were made, not in conference rooms, but in whispers, not in policy papers, but in barracks.
Not for reform, but for revenge.
The men planning what would come next did not see themselves as villains. Like the January plotters before them, they believed they were correcting an injustice. They believed Nigeria had been hijacked, and that force was the only language left. The cycle had begun. January taught Nigeria that soldiers could overthrow politicians. May taught Nigeria that power could be centralized without consent. What came next would teach Nigeria that violence, once unleashed, does not stay contained. Because unity imposed by force always produces resistance. And resistance in a nation armed and afraid becomes bloodshed. Ironsi wanted to save Nigeria by eliminating division. Instead, he made division unavoidable.
The nation was no longer arguing about policy.
It was preparing for war. Revenge does not arrive suddenly. It gathers quietly, fed by fear, humiliation, and silence. By July 1966, Nigeria was no longer governed by law or consensus. It was governed by suspicion. The military, now the center of power, had become a mirror of the nation's deepest divisions. Ethnic identity mattered more than rank. Loyalty mattered more than discipline. And justice mattered less than survival. Within the army, northern officers felt besieged. They believed the January coup had been selectively punished. They believed their leaders had been murdered and their grievances dismissed. They believed the new order was not neutral, but hostile.
And most dangerously, they believed no one was listening.
The counter-coup that followed was not a carefully structured takeover. It was not driven by ideology or reform. It was driven by rage.
On the night of July 28, 1966, violence erupted within military barracks across the country. Northern soldiers turned on their colleagues. Officers were dragged from their rooms. Some were beaten. Some were executed. Rank offered no protection. Innocence offered no mercy. The chain of command collapsed almost instantly. Major General Johnson Aguiyi Ironsi was visiting Ibadan when the uprising reached him. He was captured by soldiers who had once sworn loyalty to him. There was no negotiation, no trial, no attempt at restraint. Ironsi was tortured. Then he was killed. With his death, Nigeria lost not just a head of state, but any remaining illusion of stability.
The counter-coup succeeded where the January coup had failed. Power shifted decisively. Northern officers assumed control of the military government. But the victory came at an enormous cost.
The violence did not remain confined to the barracks. As word spread, civilian populations were drawn into the storm. In cities across the north, particularly in urban centers with large eastern populations, mobs formed. Fear turned neighbors into enemies. Ethnic identity became a death sentence. Eastern Nigerians were targeted, attacked, and killed. Homes were burned, businesses destroyed, families shattered. The violence was spontaneous in some places, organized in others, but everywhere it was devastating. The state did little to stop it. Nigeria was now experiencing something far more dangerous than a coup. It was experiencing ethnic cleansing. Trains carried refugees instead of goods. Roads filled with people fleeing southward. Entire communities were uprooted overnight. The social fabric of the nation tore apart at its weakest seams. For the eastern region, this violence was not abstract. It was personal, it was lived, it was witnessed, and it was remembered.
Every killing deepened resentment. Every failure to intervene confirmed betrayal.
Trust was no longer damaged, it was destroyed. In the aftermath of the counter-coup, Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon emerged as head of state. He was young, cautious, and unexpected. His appointment was intended to stabilize the country, to signal moderation after bloodshed. But the damage was already done. Gowon inherited a nation traumatized beyond repair. He spoke of reconciliation, he spoke of unity, he spoke of healing, but words cannot reverse massacres, promises cannot resurrect the dead, and speeches cannot rebuild trust once it has collapsed. For Eastern leaders, the message was clear. The Nigerian state could no longer guarantee their safety. Dialogue became impossible. Negotiations failed. Conferences collapsed. Every attempt at compromise was interpreted as weakness or deception.
Nigeria was no longer a single nation debating its future. It was multiple nations preparing for separation. The violence of July 1966 achieved what no politician had intended. It made coexistence feel impossible.
The counter-coup had begun as retaliation against a perceived injustice. It ended as a national trauma that reshaped identities, loyalties, and destinies. And like the January coup before it, it taught a brutal lesson that once violence becomes a political tool, it spreads beyond its original target. It consumes soldiers and civilians alike. It escapes control, and it leaves behind consequences that cannot be managed by force. Nigeria had crossed another line. First, it learned that soldiers could overthrow politicians. Then, it learned that soldiers could overthrow soldiers. Now, it was learning that civilians would pay the price. The nation stood on the edge of disintegration.
Secession was no longer a threat whispered in private. It was a possibility discussed openly. Survival was no longer assumed. It was questioned.
The events of July 1966 did not end Nigeria, but they made Nigeria unrecognizable.
The country that emerged afterward was ruled not by trust, but by fear. Not by consensus, but by force. Not by shared destiny, but by competing memories of injustice.
The coups had not saved Nigeria. They had prepared it for war. The violence of 1966 did not end with the coups.
It only changed form.
By the end of that year, Nigeria was still standing, but it was no longer whole. The country existed in a state of suspended collapse, held together by military authority and the fragile hope that force could succeed where trust had failed. It could not. The eastern region, scarred by massacres and convinced that the Nigerian state could no longer protect its people, moved towards separation. Negotiations with the federal government collapsed under the weight of mutual suspicion. Each side believed the other was negotiating in bad faith. Every concession looked like a trap. By 1967, secession became reality. The Nigerian Civil War was not a sudden eruption. It was the logical conclusion of everything that began in January 1966. The coups destroyed trust. The counter-coup destroyed coexistence. The war simply formalized what had already been decided in blood.
For 3 years, Nigeria fought itself.
Millions died. Hunger was weaponized. Civilians were turned into targets. The military, now fully embedded in political life, governed through command rather than consent. Victory was achieved, but reconciliation was shallow. The war ended in 1970, but peace did not. Because the deeper damage of 1966 was not territorial, it was psychological. Nigeria emerged from the war with a new political instinct. Power belonged to those who could seize it. Democracy became conditional. Constitutions became temporary documents, respected only when convenient. Civilian rule became an experiment to be interrupted rather than a system to be protected. Coups followed coups. Each takeover traced its ancestry back to the same moment. The night guns replaced ballots. Each generation of soldiers learned the same lesson, that intervention was acceptable, even patriotic. Civilian politicians also learned a lesson. Power became something to guard, not share. Ethnic loyalty became insurance. Corruption became a survival strategy. Institutions weakened because no one trusted them to last. The military did not just rule Nigeria.
It trained Nigeria.
It trained the country to expect disruption, to fear instability, to see authority as something imposed, not earned. Even after the return to civilian rule in 1999, the shadow of 1966 remained. Elections were contested with suspicion. Defeats were rarely accepted peacefully. Political language remained militarized. Capture, conquer, take over. The logic of the coup never truly left. What Nigeria lost in 1966 cannot be measured in GDP or borders. It lost time. It lost the slow, painful process through which democracies mature. It lost the opportunity to fail, learn, and correct itself under civilian rule.
Instead, it learned shortcuts.
And shortcuts always come with hidden costs. The most tragic irony is that the men who launched the first coup believed they were saving Nigeria. The men who carried out the counter-coup believed the same. Each side justified violence as necessity. Each believed history would absolve them. History did not, because violence solved nothing. It multiplied problems. It replaced debate with bloodshed and turned disagreement into existential threat. It transformed political rivals into enemies and neighbors into strangers. The nation that emerged from 1966 was tougher, more cynical, and deeply scarred. Nigeria survived, but survival is not the same as success. To this day, debates about unity, federalism, restructuring, and national identity still circle back to the same unresolved wound. The questions Nigeria asks itself now are echoes of questions it failed to answer then. Who belongs? Who decides? Who can be trusted with power? These questions were never settled. They were interrupted. An interruption, when violent, leaves unfinished business. Nigeria's future was not destroyed in one night. But on that night, its direction changed. The country stepped onto a path where force became precedent, fear became policy, and power became something to be seized rather than shared. The coup of 1966 did not just overthrow a government. It rewrote Nigeria's political DNA. And once rewritten, it has taken generations to even begin the process of repair.